All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. Were you ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
All right. Okay, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm thrilled to have as my guest today, Marie Damgaard. Marie, welcome.
Thanks, Guy. It's delightful to spend some time with you.
Awesome. So Marie has worked in the field of trauma, addiction, and sexuality for over 15 years, beginning with research work during her undergraduate degree in the areas of aging and sexuality and sexual experiences for men and women and non-normative sexual patterns. Marie has also been trained to work alongside marginalized populations such as sex workers and transgender individuals. Other areas of clinical specialization include sexual trauma, erectile dysfunction, and chronic pelvic pain. These experiences have informed how she views the continuum of sexuality, which has various expressions and depth. Her range of expertise spans from the shadow side to sex therapy and the rainbow end of the spectrum with more nuanced behaviors through mutual negotiation and consent. Woo, Marie, welcome. Awesome. So before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently. We'll dive in.
I am born and raised in Alberta, Canada, and have moved around that province a few times. So I'm a Canadian.
Awesome. All right. So, I wanted to bring you on here because you're affiliated with Sensory Motorcycle Therapy. You work with them. They're a sponsor. I love them. I was not fortunate. I guess I was fortunate to do level 1 and level 2 training, and it just changed my life. But we'll get into that. But how did you get here to this space, this place?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a bit of a winding road that helped me arrive here. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot and Métis people, also known as Treaty 7. I think that I was thinking about this before I came on today, and there's a lot of different aspects that sort of brought me to this road of working with people and their traumatic experiences. I think that a constant or core aspect throughout all of this is that I've always been passionate about working with people.
Mm-hmm.
And in truth, I'm pretty comfortable working in sort of the taboo areas of human experience, and have realized recently that I have a pretty natural ability to hold people in these spaces without much effort. And so it's sort of a gentle process of holding stillness and disruption of pattern responses in others, which is quite a paradox, I guess. I guess initially in my undergraduate degree, I worked as a bartender and I was a MasterCard fraud specialist, both of which helped me financially get through school. And as an eager learner, along with the content that I was learning, I think working as a bartender taught me how to listen to people. And as a fraud specialist, it actually taught me how to regulate people's central nervous systems. And so, part of my curiosity throughout my education was I was always curious about relationships and sexuality and how one develops and fosters healthy sexuality and sexual connection. And, I dated a lot of harmful people with destructive patterns. And I was just really curious, like, how the fuck does this dysfunction keep happening? Like, what is wrong with my picker? That with every person that I picked, it just started getting worse with each choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I was really fortunate to have, sorry, this is really long-winded, guy.
No, this is great. This is good.
So I was really fortunate to have professors that really appreciated my engagement and curiosity to understand, as I often brought multiple questions, different perspectives, and seeing how the stuff that we were learning related to people. And I was so fortunate to have my presence supported and nurtured in many classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I finished up my undergraduate degree in psychology and had some traumatic experiences occur, which I guess is like most students, it pushed me into taking some electives in philosophy and addictions counseling. And previous to this, I had completed some research about non-normative sexual patterns, and I was really curious about the addictive processes that were intertwined with some of the people being studied.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I completed some addiction courses, I became much more curious about behavioral processes and how they intertwined with substance use. And as I continued to learn and became more interested in intimacy disorders, specifically compulsive sexual behavior and betrayal trauma, and I was someone who was really familiar to those patterns of being, I decided to apply to grad school in hopes of learning more of a non-pathologizing way to work with people who experience these issues, not just a disease model. So I headed into grad school in counseling psychology, specializing in mental health and addictions. I was really lucky to be in a program that worked from a dominant psychospiritual perspective. So non-pathologizing, wasn't focused on disease models of addiction and mental health. And I started to learn about phenomenology and hermeneutics, which was, a methodology that I used in my graduate thesis work and will most likely use in my PhD dissertation as well. And basically, it was about working with people's experiences and how they made meaning from them. And as humans, we're meaning-making creatures, right? So it led me to my graduate work, which was about women's understanding of their self-defined grotesque sexual experiences. And this was really interesting because I caught a lot of shit for this topic when I went through it and how the topic was framed. I had a lot of, I wanted to do it for women and men, but I had a lot of male supervisors that were saying, no one is going to understand this, what you're inquiring about. And to which my response was, you don't understand women's sexual experiences, and I'll show you. And it was a really interesting body of work that was about discovering the meanings and resulting transformations that these women had undertaken in their experience of sexuality themselves and beyond. And sort of the main three themes that came from it was like patriarchy as a sculptor of the grotesque, the different ways that they denied their authentic self, and then becoming transformed through transgression. And I was so curious about how this stuff played out in therapy as I was exploring it through an Eastern lens of Tantra, not the watered down, Western version of this. And at the same time, I was completing a lot of research on men's health, and was also curious about the social construction and societal impacts of, identity development in men. Pretty much learning about how patriarchy and misogyny screws men over too, and really who does it not screw over. But it was kind of multifaceted as I was moving through this.
All right, well, I got to pause you here. So hold on. So okay, a few things that I want to get to. I mean, there was a lot, but really, really good. So you mentioned taboo areas, you mentioned non-normative, and you mentioned grotesque sexual experiences.
Yeah.
I want to put those aside.
Sure.
You talked about challenging / maybe difficult relationships that you had. Were those the experiences that made you want to study this stuff?
Yeah, I think that it really pushed me to sort of look at my own life. I was going to say, as I started to train in intimacy disorders, Pat Ogden's work, sensory motor psychotherapy, found me. And at the same time, I started to learn about dissociation and perhaps maybe how dissociative I was, and how much of a trauma history I had. So I think I was trying to nail it from a top-down approach. If I researched this, if I read about this, I could understand this, but was missing that other bottom-up part, right? Yeah.
So, when you say taboo areas, I think maybe some of us can quickly come up with a definition of that. But how do you define that? What are those taboo areas?
Taboo areas are, areas in which society or patriarchy or culture tells us that they're not okay to talk about. Let's think about sex, which, you and I will probably talk about a bit later. That is, as sexualized of a society as we are, it's a lot of people are not talking about it. They're not talking about it in a healthy way, nor are they getting accurate sexual education. And this sort of creates a facet that people are not learning healthy sexual practices or are becoming dissociative around sex and dissociative sexuality, right?
And in terms of non-normative, how would you define that?
Oh, non-normative, I think back then, which would be like a long, long time ago when I did that research. They would talk about it in terms of paraphilias. You know, at that point, I was researching about feederism, which is an area in which people were getting turned on by being fed. So there was feeders, and a feedie was someone who would receive food, and their goal was to get as big as they possibly could. The goal was to get between 400 to 700 pounds, and the bigger they were, the more erotic it was and turned on they were. Wow. And so when I was doing this research, I started to see an addictive piece, or possibly what could be an addiction, because I was really curious about it. And the faculty that I was doing this work under didn't have any experience with addiction. And so that sort of pushed me into taking courses into understanding what addiction is and what it could be.
Mm-hmm. And in terms, I was trying to get these definitions. In terms of, was this the title of your thesis, the grotesque experiences?
Yeah,
sexual experiences?
Transforming the grotesque illumination of female sexuality.
Grotesque, okay, what do you mean by that?
Continuum of experiences. So I didn't give the women a definition of what grotesque was. I just asked them if they had ever experienced grotesque sexual experiences. And every woman was able to share experiences with me. So many of them was traumatic. For many of them, it was dissociation. For many of them, it was sexual harm, you know, sexual violence of some sort, and trauma, essentially, right?
Now, what's your mission with this? Because there's a theme here that obviously we're talking. What's your entree? What's your mission into this work?
I think that part of what I was really interested in, and currently am interested in, is helping people reclaim themselves and not be in a shame-based existence, and not feeling bad about their sexuality, or expressing their sexuality, or exploring their sexuality, right? And helping people to come out of sort of this dissociative cloud to find healthy ways to navigate that aren't harming themselves or others that they love.
Mm-hmm. And how do you do that?
That's a really good question, Guy. I think that
give us a specific example, because I know you threw out a lot of generalities there, but give us a specific example.
Of working with. Okay. Talk about women who come into my office that enjoy sex and have a problem with that, or that society says that they're not allowed to be okay with enjoying sex. Or individuals who come into my practice who are using excessive amounts of pornography because they don't have the tools to talk with their partner about exploring what they want to explore in their own sexuality. You know, those are a couple ways that we start to help people's bodies get comfortable with some of these conversations, and also explore, are they engaging in some of these sexual practices from a trauma reenactment, or are you engaging in some of these practices because this is the core of who you are, and this is what you authentically want? You know, a woman came into my practice. She had been sexually abused by her father growing up, and every time that she or he orgasmed, he used to put a cigarette out on her body. And so she would ask these things of her current partners, which of course resulted in some pretty big injuries. Her not really understanding why it was a problem. And once we started to work together over, less than a year, she was able to understand that there was a trauma reenactment. She was dissociating, that what she grew up with her family was harmful, and that, she didn't necessarily want that. So it became more, for me, and when we talk about SP, it's like, it's more about choice, right? And helping people, become curious about their own expression of sexuality and what fosters this, versus these trauma patterns that are pretty unsatisfying for most people.
Well, let's talk more about that. How did sensorimotor psychotherapy, you mentioned Pat Ogden, first of all, how did you encounter sensorimotor psychotherapy and or Pat Ogden?
Yeah, well, Pat's book, Trauma in the Body, found me in grad school. And it actually began to change how I understood trauma, right? And what my clients were experiencing. And it invited me to shift into a different way of working with it, perhaps maybe even more of an integrative way. So what happened was I, found a level 1 in Vancouver, and I flew out there to take it, right? And I took level 2 as well. And in all transparency, was very dissociated between both between both levels, as I was just not aware of my own trauma history. And you know, it changed me. I share with people, sensory motor psychotherapy saved my life.
Mm.
I, you know, don't know if I'd be here today without that. So
How so?
well, I think that, you know, I was struggling with a lot of things. I was struggling in relationships. I couldn't figure out why I was in a lot of these relationships with people that were harmful, which, you know, of course has some pretty big impacts on your being. And you know, I tried some different therapists, and, you know, I think there was some expectations for me to feel emotions a certain way, or there was an expectation to fit me into a model, and
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't working. Parts of it could work, and then all of a sudden I would just become so dysregulated when someone was demanding me to feel something a certain way and I wasn't. Right. So then it just sort of added to the shame of me feeling like I'm wrong.
Right.
Right.
So sensory motor psychotherapy, or SP,
Yeah.
what gave you an allowance or permission, or allowed you to honor who you were in your body?
Yeah. And for me, the selling point is it was about choice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I use this even with clients, you know, today. Many clients that have come to see me have spent decades of being sort of stuck in these compulsive patterns that are causing harm. And it wasn't until we started using some SP that they began to have more choice around their behaviors and the way in which they interacted in the world, and themselves. And so that was my same experience with SP. It became choice, and it provided a pathway for me to explore some of these experiences that I had had, to have some resolution to them, or even some completion to them, or you know, looking at my organization of experience and why I was organized a particular way
Mm-hmm.
around certain contexts or certain people or certain triggers, right? So it really challenged my understanding of trauma and the power of implicit memory.
How would choice come into play with a particular client who maybe wasn't aware that they did have a choice? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, most people who come in to see me who experience compulsive sexual behavior disorder, there is no choice, right? It is an it's an automaticity that comes. It is a impulsive, compulsive way of being that they are finding, you know, a struggle in sort of getting out of those patterned responses.
Mm-hmm.
And what I started to notice is once we brought the body into it, people could have choice about, do I want to engage in this pattern or do I not want to? Could I resource my body and perhaps maybe think about this choice versus, you know, going and, you know, having another affair or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
anything like that, right?
And bringing the body into it does does what? Does it take them out of their dissociation, or how does that work for them?
Well, SP, as you know, is a body-based approach. And what it did is it, you know, I mean, there's multiple maps that Pat shares with us in our trainings, right? I mean, there's, you know, window of tolerance using Dan Siegel's work. There's the modulation model. There's learning to work with autonomic nervous arousal, but it's sort of that affect piece, right? It's working with that, um, you know, sensory affective or, you know, movement information to address traumatic or relational, you know, ruptures.
Mm-hmm.
And part of when people were able to let the body do something that it wasn't able to do, or work through that activation that's kind of stirring in their system, they don't need to go to something external as a way to get away from all of this. They have a way to resource and regulate themselves, which allows them to have choice again of, are they going to engage in the addictive behavior or compulsive behavior, or would you like to call a friend and talk about how, you know, you're really triggered or feel shame or struggling with something, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is intense. I mean, it is. There's no two ways about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think for me, just alone talking about trauma is
Yeah.
intense.
Right.
You're bringing in this whole discussion about sexuality on what, a taboo level, or really, for lack of a better word, a very intense level about paraphilias and the spectrum of sexuality. in a non-pathologizing way, right?
Right.
I think normally our culture looks at paraphilias as pathologizing. Help us understand, where are paraphilias on the continuum of, can you even say normal sexual behavior?
I,
Is that even a
I,
thing?
yeah, I'm not sure that we would use that language in terms of sex therapists, but I think that when we take a look at people who experience compulsive sexual behavior, right? There is a history of trauma and shame throughout their lifespan. There are often issues in their dissociative sexuality, and understanding the kind of traumatic experiences that they've had that inform sexuality that feels shameful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's a big core piece, right? Here's a question I often ask people, Guy. If you were to think about your sexual education experience, formal or informal learning, what did you actually learn that applies to your sex life and sexuality today? Right? Did the
Right.
condom on banana work? Does it work to actually put a condom on a banana? It's not the same as putting it on a penis. Let's just call that straight. Right? Or, segregated sex, girls over here, boys over here,
Right.
reproductive only,
Right.
abstinence based, right?
Right.
Like what,
Right.
just thinking about even when we're
Right.
in school,
It's
right?
so taboo.
It's so taboo.
Right. It's so crazy.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting, teaching at the university and college here, or even with clients or talking with, lovely colleagues like yourself, and talking about, some of our own sexual education and how it absolutely does not apply to real life.
Right.
That is a problem. That is a cultural aspect. That is a problem that shows up in my therapy room all the time.
Right. So, what do you recommend to kind of break that mold?
Wow. That's a big question, right? I think, boy, here's where I would start. I think that what I have learned working with younger people, like university and college students, is that most people are now getting sexual education or receiving sexual education from pornography. And, the average age, some research is saying that kids are exposed to pornography are between 6 to 9, right? And parents aren't talking about it. And schools aren't really talking about it. And everyone's just so uncomfortable talking about it. And so it's a good question about where do we start,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get comfortable. If you're not comfortable, find a therapist who is comfortable, find some books to find ways to talk to your kids about these things. And just, I think also having the reality that if we have kids or adolescents, using a lot of pornography, this does sculpt the brain in a way that can be problematic for some.
Yeah, I have a 13-year-old boy,
Yeah.
and this is ringing true to me right
Right.
now.
Right.
Just how do we? It's so crazy. I mean, it's. I'm having a mirror experience here. When I started this podcast,
Right.
I was working in a clinic in Northern California. We were assessing and treating young individuals who were showing
Mhm.
early signs of psychosis, most
Mhm.
of whom, not surprisingly, had experienced trauma.
Right.
But the teachers didn't know, the parents didn't know, and I got to a point where, like, what the hell is going on here? We need to talk more about this, and
Totally.
that's kind of what you're doing here too. It's so it's enlightening, it's freeing,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it gives room to sort of not get stuck in this box, and also, offers opportunity for repair if there are ruptures around that. I don't have kids, so I can't say what it would be like as a parent, but I do know what it's like working, with parents, or even my niece and nephews, about how uncomfortable or entangled some of these topics and discussions are. But it's really trying to just bring your most open self to have these honest, open conversations around sexuality, healthy sexuality, and trying to not sort of let the porn industry dictate what your kid is going to find erotic.
Were you were you always this open?
Oh, I think so in some aspect, right? I
Okay.
mean, I've got a pretty extensive trauma history myself, some of it around, sexual trauma. I know in my high school yearbook, I said I wanted to become a sex therapist, and here we are. And it was great to see my vice principal have to say that on stage. That was really great. That had me giggling. But I think, yeah, in some aspects. And then once, I had more understanding of dissociation and trauma and I became more regulated, it's just been so much easier to have some of these conversations and again, hold space to disrupt some of these patterns. And also, hold and be in stillness while people chew on these things to make sense about what is erotic for them or, sexual for them.
Who are your ideal clients?
Ooh. Who are my ideal client? That's a good question. I think people who are just wanting to heal and get clarity and understand. I have a lot of clients who have some pretty extensive sexual trauma, and for most of them, men and women, it's just trying to sort of break free from that and have a healthy sense of intimacy because they never had healthy intimacy modeled.
Mm-hmm.
Technology, can foster, I guess, healthy technology, but can also create a lot of pathways for people to start looking elsewhere, right? Rather than putting work into certain, their main relationships. And I think just being with people to let them, explore what turns them on and what gets them excited without shame.
Mm-hmm.
And
how would you describe or define healthy intimacy?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure that it's totally up to me to define that. I think that's per person, but I do think what I hope to bring is that there's self-awareness and self-knowledge. I think that they are regulated and know, when they're not regulated versus when they are. I think it's about finding ways to have open and honest dialogue. And I mean, the big piece for me that's really obvious is that it's not coming up from a shame-based place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That we're having these conversations that are intense, as you said, right, Guy? Like trauma is intense. And then you start adding on, how it impacts sexuality. It's like this whole other layer that a lot of people don't want to talk about, or they don't even want to acknowledge, right? Because they don't know how, or our culture says this doesn't exist. Right.
Right. I really like you, and I really like you because you're disarming. You're talking about this stuff. No, seriously, and it makes me feel freer and more open. And I could see how you would be, and slash you probably are, a really amazing therapist. We need people like you in this. We don't have a lot of them.
Right.
We don't.
It's true. It's true.
God. All right. So do you just see clients? Do you work with therapists also? What's your thing?
Well, I have a few different roles. So I have clients that come in to see me. I work at the university and college here in Lethbridge as an instructor. I teach psychology and compulsive sexual behavior disorder course, the only one in Canada, I think, here at the university. And then I also consult with therapists, right, to help them become more comfortable as some of these issues start to show up in session, and to not feel scared about asking about someone's, sexual history, pornography use, masturbation. Where did you learn about sex? All of those different things.
And do you do that on a one-on-one thing, or do you have courses when you're working with therapists?
One-on-one, or if there's a therapist that come in and say, hey, I'd be curious to learn about this, I'm happy to take that on. And I think also in the midst of developing some additional resources for therapists in this as well.
Right. Wow. Well, awesome. Marie, awesome talking to you. I'd love to have you back.
Great.
You're doing it. I mean, you're in a class by yourself. I've interviewed a lot of people, and you're on a mission.
I am. And I'm really happy to be here with you in that mission.
I appreciate it. All right. Best way for people to get in contact with you?
Probably just go on my website, which I think Guy has the URL, and there's a button to say, email Marie, and it will email me. So feel free.
Awesome. Marie, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Guy.
All right. Bye-bye. I want to thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I want to let you know that I am very excited about my new podcast, the Right Now Project. The Right Now Project is about healing. It's about stepping into our own courage and authenticity and getting started or continuing along our healing process. We're all going through something, whatever it is, in this crazy life we're living. And the Right Now Project is about honoring that, celebrating that, and sharing our stories via the associated membership site. Check us out at therightnowproject.com, therightnowproject.com.